Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Somm TV podcast. My name is Jason Wise. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful weekend. I want to tell all of you we're almost there. We are just days away from the release of Cup of Salvation on Somm TV. This will be available first for the first month starting January 23rd as a rental and a buy. We have to do this for a number of reasons. Some of them have to do with licensing and rights and others, but it will be available. I know many of you have waited a long, long time. So wherever you are, you'll be able to rent or buy Cup of Salvation. And then February 23rd, it will be available to Somm TV subscribers. Obviously, it's going to roll out on other platforms and things like that. But right now, this is the only news I can give you. And I would recommend you go there, pre-order it, but get ready for the rental. It's going to be fantastic. I will have the link for that in the show notes here, wherever you listen, or you can go to sommtv.com and find that. On today's podcast, I was digging through the interviews from Cup of Salvation, and there's a really fascinating one with renowned grape geneticist Carol Meredith. She's been in a lot of our films, but she is one of the top scholars in the world who pioneered using genetics to track down where grapes came from. And it's been a pleasure to work with her. So I took one of her interviews from Cup of Salvation, and I'm going to play that for all of you to talk about kind of where grapes originated from, how they spread. And the way she speaks is so fascinating. I can only imagine what it would have been like to take a class of hers at UC Davis when she was a professor there. So we're going to talk about the origin of grapes, which really has a lot to do with Cup of Salvation. And before I do that, I want to tell everybody we have hours and hours of original, brand new bonus content and new documentaries coming to Somm TV around Cup of Salvation. So beginning the 23rd, or right after there, we're going to start releasing all of these things that are full of not just, spoilers, but they expand upon the story. They get into some pretty deep, sometimes very emotional topics that happen in the movie. We've had to hold these because so many of you haven't seen the movie yet. So we're going to start releasing those on Somm TV since the film will be available on the 23rd of January. So I recommend very strongly that you go and rent this film, watch it, and then let us know what your thoughts are on social media. We're dying to hear what you all think finally of this movie. Without further ado, my conversation with the great Carol Meredith, grape geneticist and winemaker in Napa Valley. Carol, I want to start with a pretty basic question. Where are grapes from that we make our wine with?
Wine grapes are native to the whole Mediterranean basin and river valleys that come up from the Mediterranean in every direction. So there is no one place that wine grapes are from. There's plenty of evidence, mostly from like wild pollen deposits and fossils and things like that, that show grapes have grown wild for a very, very long time all around the Mediterranean. That's both the north and the south shores, the eastern end. So very far into Western Asia, all the way into Afghanistan and Pakistan. So pretty far east. And that's all Vitis vinifera, which is the species that we make wine from. There are plenty of other grapes that grow in other parts of the world. There's a lot of grapes that are native to North America. There's some native to Central America. There's quite a few native to China. But the grape that we make wine from, that most wine in the world is made from, is Vitis vinifera, and that is from the Mediterranean basin and into Western Asia.
So when we set out to make Cup of Salvation, we traveled all the way across the world to a country called Armenia. There was an amazing discovery there, a cave that goes back 6, 8, maybe more 1,000 years to Neolithic period. And in this cave, the reason we went to go investigate this was because they had discovered winemaking on a larger scale than just they made some wine. They were doing it on an actual scale. And I want to ask you, what's the significance of finding a cave where you can find a large scale of winemaking?
I think the significance is whenever you find evidence of wine production, that is evidence that people harvested grapes. It's not evidence, and it's important to distinguish this. Finding evidence of ancient winemaking is not evidence that people grew grapes, because grapes grew wild. And so initially, people would simply harvest grapes, just like they harvested a lot of other wild food. Before agriculture, people found their food either on the run or growing in the woods or along riverbanks. And so grapes would grow in a lot of places, especially along rivers. And wild grapes would grow up into the trees. And some of those grapes would be male plants where you would find no fruit at all, but other plants would be female, and they would be the ones that would carry the fruit. So if people found a vine growing fairly close to their settlement, they would pick that fruit and bring it back to their village. And I think that at first people were probably just eating the fruit. It tasted really good. It was sweet and juicy. It tasted really good. And I think that it was only later that they made wine. And I always like to say that wine was not invented, it was discovered. Because if you collect a bunch of wild grapes and you put them in a pot, thinking that you're going to get to them in a couple of days because you picked so many, you can't eat them all today. Your family has plenty to eat today. So you're going to put them in a pot, and that'll give you enough grapes to eat later in the week. Well, guess what? If you put a bunch of grapes in a pot, just the weight of the grapes will start to break some of the grapes. The juice is going to come out. There's yeast everywhere. Wild yeast is everywhere. And that juice is going to start to ferment, and you're going to have wine. Without knowing what you were doing, you're going to have wine in that pot that you put the grapes in. And so people would then discover that, that tastes kind of good. And so eventually they would figure out that it's the grapes that I picked and left for a while in that pot. That became wine. So then they would begin to do it deliberately, and they would, of course, refine the method, and eventually it would become much larger scale. But the initial experience with wine would be as a discovery, a natural process, not as something that they intellectually invented. So it was only after experiencing wine as a natural consequence of having grapes sitting around that they would then begin to learn more about the process. So it still doesn't mean that they were growing grapes, but eventually, as with all of the early fruit crops, and by that I mean figs, dates, olives, grapes, people would find them growing wild and would figure out that if they took a stick and put it in the ground near their village, it would grow. And so that's a lot more convenient than going out in the woods and having to climb a tree to get some grapes. If you have that vine that always has a lot of great fruit, and if you take some sticks off that and stick them in the ground, you're going to perpetuate the particular characteristics of that vine in your own village. So that would be the beginning of cultivation, which to my mind would have been later than the first winemaking.
It's incredible. Are there any grapes still growing today that are ancient genetic material? I mean, so as close as we can get to the same grapes that would have been grown in Neolithic times when people were just collecting them and finding out, discovering wine, do any of those still exist today? And if they do, where are they? Are they in the same place? I mean, we obviously have a lot of grapes in the film that we're trying to see where they come from and see how old they are. Could any of those be ancient plant material?
It's hard to say. In order to identify an ancient grape conclusively, you'd have to get DNA out of it. And ancient plant remains rarely have intact DNA, although the techniques for trying to extract DNA from old material are getting better and better and better. But I think that they're not quite to the point where you could conclusively identify a variety. You could group it maybe. You can say it has something in common with this variety, but I'm not sure that you could conclusively identify it. It's entirely possible that some of the grapes that are grown today are very, very ancient. I know in the work that I've done with some of the grapes from Western Europe, for some of them we've been able to find parents. But for some of them, we have never been able to find parents no matter how hard we look. And that is consistent with the possibility that these varieties might have actually been wild. Pinot Noir is that way. Pinot Noir, we've never found the parents of Pinot Noir. And it's possible that it was a wild or a very close to wild. It might have been the seedling of a wild vine. Very close to wild, so very ancient. So when you can't find the progenitors of a variety, despite having looked really, really hard, that's evidence that it might be very, very old. But it's still a technical challenge to take plant remains from an archaeological site and to match them with a present-day variety conclusively. But I hope that within a few years, I think it will be possible. I know, for example, when we were working to find the origin of Zinfandel, and we were looking in Croatia, and there was a museum specimen. It was dried leaves from a vine that we suspected was Zinfandel. And when we first encountered that museum specimen around 2000, 2001, it wasn't technically possible to get DNA out of that specimen. And so we had to just say, well, it looks like Zinfandel. It probably is Zinfandel, but we can't prove it. 10 years later, some Croatian researchers developed a proficiency in getting DNA out of archaeological plant material. And so they took a crack at that old museum specimen, and they got DNA out of it, and we were able to prove it was Zinfandel. So that was in a period of 10 years that technology advanced to the point where an old specimen that we couldn't conclusively identify, then we could. And I think that we'll see that working with other old plant materials associated with winemaking and grape growing. One of the difficulties, though, is that when you look at an ancient winemaking site or even the site of a village where you have garbage piles, which is often where some of the most interesting stuff comes out of, is the garbage piles. When you're making wine, or even if you're just eating grapes, the garbage is the seeds. That is what persists. Very rarely there would be maybe a piece of stem, but most of the preserved remains associated with winemaking, biological remains, are seeds. And the seed of a grape is not the same variety as the grapevine it came from. And so that's the technical kind of sticking point, is that even if you can get really good DNA out of the seeds at an ancient winemaking site, you won't be able to match it to the vine that those seeds came from because they're genetically different, just like you are genetically different than your biological father. You're closely related, but you're not the same. And the same can be said for a grape seed and a grapevine. So that's going to be a problem in trying to prove, using ancient winemaking sites, to be able to prove the identity of a variety. You're going to be able to say it shares a lot with this variety that we still grow today, but you're not going to be able to say it's exactly the same.
One of the main grapes that sort of made us make Cup of Salvation is this particular one called Arni. And we've covered it on the podcasts and have a lot of things on SOM TV. It's a major part of Cup of Salvation. Arni comes from right in the area you're talking about in the Caucasus Mountains, where it is ground zero. Is there a chance Arni could be one of the oldest grapes in the world? This grape that we base the film around, or part of the film?
It is possible that Arni is a very ancient grape. And I think coming from that part of the world only increases the possibilities for it being very ancient.
If it was that ancient, what would it mean to winemaking and to the study of grapes, the whole field? What does that actually, what does that mean?
I'm not sure what it would mean. I think the meaning would be in the mind of the beholder. I mean, it's going to mean different things to different people. For some people, it's not going to mean a thing. What's going to matter is, does the wine taste good? And where is it being grown today, and how is it being grown? But the history might not matter so much.
I think it matters a huge amount. I mean, if this were to be one of the first grapes that helps spread and create all the grapes we drink, I mean, I think that is a profound thing. Also, it does taste great. I mean, Arni is a delicious wine, so it kind of does help the argument there. Don't you think it's very strange that a country like Armenia is kind of starting over, but yet they have this potentially ancient piece of, it's almost like a trophy in their hands? It's a very odd thing, right?
It is a strange irony that Armenia is on the verge of starting over, or is starting over, with very ancient plant material. And I'm not sure that's ironic, as it is a connection. You know, it's not like they're starting over because they've still got a piece of their history right there. Their viticultural history is right there in the form of these ancient plants. These plants themselves are not that ancient, but if they have been propagated by cuttings all along, And they're not using any rootstocks. And so it's a good chance that they've simply been propagated by cuttings all along. And so they may well be very, very ancient. There are other ancient grapes. A lot of the table grape varieties that are grown in the Middle East and in Western Asia are thought to be very, very ancient. A lot of the Muscat wine grapes are thought to be very ancient. So I think that there are a lot of ancient grapes around still. Because agriculture has been continuous in these places, there's every reason to think that the plant material has been carried along. So I think that it's highly likely that some of the grapes grown in that part of the world are really, really ancient varieties.
I want to thank everybody for listening, and I especially want to thank Carol Meredith for just enlightening us on kind of the path of grapes and her opinions on how it happens. I just adore talking to these people, and thank you all for listening. I want to thank John Adams, our producer of this episode, and I want to tell everyone, remind you again, we are just days away from Cup of Salvation. In fact, depending on when you're listening to this, it could be available. So Tuesday, January 23rd, worldwide, it will be available to rent and buy the fourth Psalm movie, Cup of Salvation, on Psalm TV. And then in February, it will be streaming for all subscribers. So thank you all for your patience with that. And tune into all the bonus features coming as well, because we have some incredible stuff. Next week's podcast, I am going to speak with a winemaker named Mo Mumtazi, who owns Maysara Winery up in the Willamette Valley. He is a cast member of Cup of Salvation. And his journey to escape from Iran after the revolution in 1979 and make wine in the United States is one of the most harrowing and fascinating stories I've ever encountered in wine. And it's partly why it's a major part of the film. And we're going to speak to him on next week's podcast, and I hope you join us there. Please reach out to us on social media and let us know what you think of the new film. We are just so excited for all of you to see it. I hope all of you have a wonderful week, and I hope it's filled with something delicious. Talk to you very soon. Bye-bye.